everyone and why?
Hi, it's good to see everybody. My name is Richard Cohen. I'm the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm here today with Joyce Vance. I know a lot of you people will recognize Joyce. She's a regular contributor to MSNBC. She's one of their great legal analysts. For close to 8 years, from August of 2009 until January of 2017, Joyce was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. She was actually one of the first U.S. attorneys nominated by President Obama and unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Prior to that time, she had had a long and distinguished career as a prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney, and before that, she had worked in 2 very prestigious law firms. Joyce, I understand you're a graduate of Bates College.
That's true.
And a graduate of my university, the University of Virginia. And Joyce, I'm much older than Joyce, so Joyce and I did not overlap.
He's going to pitch softballs like this the whole time.
Yeah.
But I'm going to try to behave.
And, today, in addition to being an MSNBC contributor, I understand that you're a visiting professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. And what are you teaching?
So this year I've taught criminal justice reform, and I'm teaching criminal procedure as well.
Okay, well, I will ask a couple questions about that.
Outstanding.
I really appreciate your joining us today.
Glad to be with y'all.
Joyce, I don't know if the audience who's joining us here today really understands what a U.S. attorney does. Talk a little bit about that.
So there are 93 U.S. attorneys in the country. They're the top federal law enforcement officers in their respective districts, spread out across the country. They work for the Attorney General, but they do have a lot of control in their own districts. By statute, U.S. attorneys have 3 jobs. They're charged with enforcing the criminal laws of the United States, with representing the United States in civil actions, monetary judgment type situations in court when the United States gets sued, sometimes pursuing civil actions on behalf of the United States, and also with collecting certain kinds of monetary judgments. And then I would just add, Richard, that under the Obama administration, the marching orders that were given to the U.S. attorneys was enact policy that makes your community safer. So that was in many ways our touchstone. Are you engaging in criminal justice and prosecutions in a way that makes your community safer?
Now, when you were appointed by President Obama, did you speak with him?
I did not. I'd spoken with him one time for about 2 seconds at a function many years earlier.
At that time, did he ask you for your loyalty?
I was not asked to pledge loyalty, although Eric Holder did ask that I bake chocolate chip cookies for him.
And it's a serious question.
Yeah, it is a serious question.
When you hear about the president asking Mr. Comey for loyalty, that kind of thing, what do you think of?
That's an appalling violation of the rule of law. So among the Obama U.S. attorneys, there was no U.S. attorney who met with the president and was, asked for a loyalty pledge or anything else in exchange for the job. What we were asked to do and what President Obama told us was, he said, I appointed you, but you don't work for me. You work for the American people. And he told us that his expectation was that we would serve with independence and integrity.
Now, when you mentioned that one of the 3rd things that you were charged to do as a U.S. attorney was to make your community better, what was the thing that you did to do that? What was the most important thing in your mind that you did to do that?
Right. So, I was the United States Attorney in Birmingham. Birmingham obviously has a wide variety of civil rights issues, and the nature of some of those might surprise people. We were engaged protecting the civil rights of veterans, of military veterans who experienced some real legal issues, as we were on protecting the rights in our African American community, our LGBTQ community, our immigrant community. But that, I thought, was some of the most important work that we had to first develop and then pursue in our district.
Now, if I recall, you set up a special office.
I set up a unit, a division.
What was that unit called?
It was a civil rights enforcement unit, but it was an evolutionary process. We had a group of lawyers who did that work, walking in the door, and who wanted to do that work. And over time, the volume of the work, at first you thought, well, okay, we have an immigration case, we'll do that.
Yes.
But every little piece of work that we did really brought in more work. And ultimately, we needed enough lawyers to handle it on an ongoing basis. We defined criminal justice reform work as part of our civil rights portfolio. our belief, based on data, was that prevention work to prevent crime and work to help people reentering the community from prison resume successful lives rather than go back to the cycle of crime, that those were an important component of criminal justice work, along with traditional enforcement, traditional prosecutions. So much of that work we considered civil rights oriented.
Had there been a civil rights unit in the Northern District before you began one?
There had not, although we had had some very storied civil rights prosecutions.
How many? One from someone from a good friend of ours,
Our
who's
current
recently
senator.
Doug Jones. Yes,
Sure.
mentioned what that was.
So Doug decided that he wanted to try to prosecute the 16th Street church bombing, the 4 girls who were killed in 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church, just a stone's throw from our office. It was a cold case. That means it had been closed, no
Yes.
further prosecution
Yes.
possible. And Doug went on to convict the 2 remaining bombers responsible for those girls' deaths.
Before your time?
No, during my time.
Any role that you played in that?
Very early on, just a little bit, we had actually 2 bombing cases that we pursued simultaneously. We had a bombing of an abortion clinic in Birmingham.
That would be Eric Rudolph?
The Eric Rudolph case.
Talk a little bit
I
about
worked
that.
on.
I think that was really quite a horrific crime, and I think also there was a bombing in Atlanta.
That's right.
At Centennial Park.
There were 3 bombs total. So this was a January 1998 bombing in Birmingham of an abortion clinic. A Birmingham police officer was killed and a nurse was seriously injured. Over the scope of investigation, it was determined that Rudolph was also responsible for a bombing at Centennial Park in Atlanta and for a gay nightclub in Atlanta. We combined forces with prosecutors in Atlanta. Another prosecutor in Atlanta who went on to become somewhat famous, Sally Yates, who was fired a year ago today by Donald
Yeah.
Trump, was involved in the Atlanta half of that case.
You know, I was going to ask you about Sally Yates later, but I might as well ask now. Had you been in her position, had you been asked to defend the president's executive order to shut down immigration completely from a number of Muslim countries, what do you think you would have done?
Well, you know, Sally knew that that order that came from the White House was based in illegal animus towards people based on their national origin, perhaps based on religion as well. And I think that she made the right decision. One of the things that she was asked during her confirmation hearings to be Deputy Attorney General by now Attorney General Jeff Sessions was, will you commit to stand up if you're asked to enforce an illegal order? And she did exactly that.
Yeah, it's got to take a lot of courage, though, to say no to the president.
I think
it can't
so.
be an easy thing to do.
You know, she's not someone who puts herself into the limelight deliberately. I think she just did what she thought was right.
Did you know her well?
We worked together a good bit.
I see. Now, I know also while you were at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you were on, was it a special advisory committee?
So while I was the U.S. Attorney, I spent the first 2 years involved in something called the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. It's a group of U.S. attorneys that meet and help to develop policy.
National policy?
National policy, but also engage in some real mundane tasks. You know, how much money are we spending on toner, right? All of the tasks that you have to complete to manage sort of a big, multifaceted organization.
Yeah. Now, I remember shortly after President Trump took office that the Attorney General Sessions, who we both know, we'll talk a little bit about, asked for all of the then U.S. attorneys to offer their resignations, and not just offer their resignations and clean out their offices. I think it was in 2 hours on a Friday afternoon. Were you among them?
No, I had actually resigned the day before the inauguration, but I did.
Why happened to resign the day before the inauguration?
I got to submit my resignation letter to President Obama, and that gave me a lot of psychic benefit.
Yeah. You know, we both know Senator Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, fairly well. I think our office has known him for, I don't know, close to 30 years. You've known him, I'm sure, for...
Not very well, but yeah, you know, Alabama's a small place, as you know.
Yeah. And of course, you know, he was close to Trump. was the first U.S. senator to endorse him. He became the Attorney General who was nominated and confirmed. I always want to give Senator Sessions some due. I don't want to paint him as the worst person that ever lived. He was the co-sponsor with Teddy Kennedy of the Prison Rape Elimination Act. He was one of the champions in the Senate in reducing, albeit not eliminating, the disparity between crack and powder sentencing.
Did great work there.
Yeah. On the other hand, even as a senator, he had what I would consider to be a frightening record when it came to civil rights. A frightening record. And, as a progressive organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center sees what's happening at the Justice Department now, and I know, we think about it as, kind of as a disaster. I mean, I don't know what else we can say than that. Well, I don't know what else it is that we do say than that. Do you feel like that's an exaggeration?
There are some distressing trends that we see, some top-order trends. One of the most discouraging ones from my point of view is the move away from smart-on-crime policies that I believe had been successful in reducing crime and in targeting federal resources for the most serious, significant crimes.
Talk a little bit about that. Explain that a little bit more for everybody.
Well, and just to finish that thought, and then I will, though, the comparison is to Attorney General Sessions, who has explicitly returned to what he would call tough-on-crime policies. And I think that those are the failed policies of the 1980s and 1990s that led to mass incarceration. So the difference, I think, comes down to this. It's sort of a question of the metric that's being used to judge U.S. attorneys and Justice Department employees on the criminal side. Do you want to have large numbers of smaller prosecutions, or are you willing to have fewer but more significant cases done? And so just to put it in a finite context, when you look at immigration offenses, I was always willing to do fewer immigration cases, but to focus on people who had a history of violence and to ensure that those were the people present in this country without legal status who we prosecuted. Now there's been, I understand, a trend to just painting with a broader brush and prosecuting all immigration offenses without thinking through their severity. And look, there are rationales that you could employ for either one of those strategies. I'm just compelled that we do a better job of keeping our communities safer when we focus our resources in a smart way, recognizing that we don't prosecute with an unlimited budget, and focus, in fact, on those most significant kind of crimes.
Now, I've read criticism of that position, of your position.
Sure.
People have said, hell, the law is the law, and the Attorney General is just returning to the policies of the past.
Right. The Obama prosecutors were soft on crime.
Yeah.
That argument. But so the reality is this, right? You can never prosecute all the crime that's committed. We are inherently making decisions. So if the decision that we make is we'll prosecute every immigration crime, just using immigration again, every immigration crime that walks in the door without prioritizing them, well, yeah, you'll probably get a large number of cases. Some of them will be low-hanging fruit. If instead you say to your prosecutors, look at all the cases in your portfolio. You might have 40 cases. Pick the 10 most important ones and do those first. And that, I think, over time, and then if you look at the full range of priorities, right, you've got terrorism and white-collar crime and public corruption and violent crime and drugs, civil rights, and so on. And if in each of those areas you're prosecuting the most significant cases, you may have fewer numbers, but at the end of the day, the right people will be in federal prison.
When we talk about immigration, of course, Alabama had passed HB 56,
right.
One of the harshest anti-immigrant laws. Sometimes people refer to it as the Arizona law on steroids. And I know that you were the U.S. Attorney at the time.
That's right.
And took an important stance on that. Talk a little bit about that.
So we first learned about HB 56, Alabama's Deport Yourself immigration bill, while it was still working its way through the House and the Senate in Alabama.
And this is with the help of Chris Kobach.
Exactly. So Chris Kobach, who went on to have voting commission fame, is supposed to have been the author of Alabama's version. the Arizona.
We just don't have good law writers in our state.
Apparently
we needed to go to
Kansas.
yeah.
But so supposedly, the Arizona law, which
Yes.
was already in the course of litigation and working its way through the courts, they tried to refine it when they wrote Alabama's bill. They thought that they were doing a better job, which in their view, I think, meant making it legally bulletproof. As it turned out, it was not. We found 10 provisions of that law that we thought were so constitutionally deficient that we needed to challenge them. So Tom Perez, who's now the head of the DNC, was at that point the head of the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department. And Tom and I, along with Tony West, who was the head of the Civil Division, and some incredibly talented lawyers. I mean, really, I did none of the real work. But our lawyers put together a really outstanding challenge to those provisions. I know you all had a challenge to the law on some other bases, and the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church joined forces and filed a challenge for some provisions that they felt were unconstitutional as regards their parishioners. So we had these 3 cases that proceeded together in district court in Birmingham. Long story short, at the end of the day, the law was essentially gutted by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and very little of it survives.
Talk about that one section that I think most disturbed us as an organization that was aimed at children.
Yeah, so here's the most difficult part. It was in my view, too. Plyler versus Doe is a Supreme Court case that says that whether you're a citizen or not, in this country you have a right through a K through 12 education.
Case out of Texas written by Justice Powell.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the Alabama rule made it, the new law made it very difficult for school children. For instance, for them to go to school, the school was required to collect information on their parents' immigration status.
Yes.
We viewed that as at best an effort to chill, at worst an effort to arrest. And so that was one of our major bases for challenging. And I'll tell you, Richard, one of the worst moments that I had as U.S. Attorney, I never took my job personally. I tried to not, let it go home with me emotionally.
You're very different from me, I gotta tell you.
Well, I mean, you develop a hard shell in 25 years as a prosecutor. But we were at a community meeting, and at the end of the meeting, some parents brought up their kid to me, and he was about the age of my littlest kid at that time, maybe 8 or 9 years old. And they said he just wants to ask you a question. And so in perfect, fluent, unaccented English, he sort of tells me the story about how he can no longer go to the zoo with his uncle, who's just a couple years older than him, because his uncle doesn't have status. And his dad says, I told him that you would fix it. And, so I ended up hugging this little kid thinking, I absolutely have to do this. My job is to serve kids like this kid who need us to protect their civil rights. But it was heartbreaking, it was draining. We were super grateful at the end when the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in our favor and the United States Supreme Court did not take that case up. So that good ruling still holds.
Senator Sessions criticized the prosecution, did he not? Or
That's
the case
true.
that you brought.
Senator Sessions has a strong immigration agenda.
Yes.
And does not believe that we should gauge in policy that makes it easier for immigrants to be in this country, at least illegally, maybe in other ways. And so he was critical of that prosecution, and there is in fact an effort to defund that kind of work at the Justice Department.
One of the cases that we had recently was on behalf of a young woman named Daniela Vargas.
Yeah.
And, she had her father and brother had been swept up in an ICE raid, and she was told that she was given, I think the word was, a hall pass because she had a pending DACA application. And then the next day or so, she went in at a press conference and spoke out about, what had happened. And on her way home, she gets arrested by ICE agents, taken from Mississippi, and taken to a facility in Jena, Louisiana. We were lucky to be able to file a case and get her out. But the problem, of course, now is there are thousands and thousands of Daniela Vargases. And one of the things that we've done is set up very small law offices in 4 locations in the Deep South: Jena, Louisiana, Ocilla, Georgia, Folkson, Georgia, and Irwin, Georgia, where these big detention facilities are, just to give everyone there a fighting chance, because typically, especially in the Deep South, detained immigrants have almost no access to lawyers. It's the worst kind of assembly line justice. I feel like we're making some progress, but partly because we've had literally hundreds of lawyers from around the country volunteer and come and join us. We actually had a lawyer start with us not too long ago. Her name is Erin Argueta. She was a lawyer at Foley Hoag, which is a fine firm in D.C., went and spent a week at this with us, and then just gave up her life and said, no, I'm moving. And, it's rare to see that kind of courage. Really, it's really quite something.
But, who knew that the lawyers were going to emerge as the heroes? And when that first Muslim ban happened and there were, lawyers in airports, and, one of the ironies is that the now mayor in Seattle, Jenny Durkin, was one of the lawyers who rushed to the airport in Seattle when that happened to keep people from being deported. Now as mayor, she's in that group that's just been advised that they may in fact be prosecuted because of sanctuary city status. So this is a real question in our society of who are we? Are we people that recognize our roots as an immigrant country? Will we protect immigrants? Do we believe that people, without regard to their immigration status, have inherent dignity and rights? And it's a real national moment in that regard.
Right after President Kennedy was assassinated, his brother published a book that President Kennedy had written called A Nation of Immigrants, with a foreword from RFK. And of course, the world has changed so dramatically. The idea of President Trump writing a letter like that, or writing a book like that, is probably preposterous. I want to come back to something because I think it's not something well understood. You mentioned how having children in Alabama having to report, or parents having to report on their immigration status, obviously intimidated people and deterred people from going to school. Something like that right now, as I understand it, is happening with the census.
Yeah.
And I think that people don't understand that at all. And I wish you'd try to explain it and tell people a little bit what's at stake.
I'm not even sure that I can wrap my arms around it, but I'll say this. The census head count is very important. The accuracy of that count determines things like services, determines things like how voting districts are set
up. The distribution of federal money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Federal funding is in many ways determined by that. And there are two problems. Initially, you just have this perceptual problem, especially in immigrant communities when the government asks you to report your information, right? There's a little bit of a hesitancy. Well, it's even worse in the current environment, and we know that the Justice Department has now recommended that questions about immigration status be asked in the census, which, not appropriate, shouldn't happen, but it is clearly an effort, in my judgment, to intimidate these communities from participating in census, which will further disadvantage them. Here's the irony. It's really to the disadvantage of states like Alabama, of red states, to have a lower count. Actually, if there was a higher population count in states like Alabama, it would benefit us in a lot of ways, including perhaps avoiding the loss of a congressional district. So there's a real tension here, I think, that folks are going to have to resolve between conservative ideology and practical philosophy.
So are there legal avenues to pursue to force the census not to ask that question? I can't think of one. That's why I brought you here today to ask you that.
Good. I'm so glad that you're asking me the easy questions.
Yes.
I think that there are a lot of people who are struggling with that question.
Yes.
I have looked at it a little bit. I'm not an immigration expert. And I think the easy answer is this. There's not a direct route to challenge it. There may be others that come up as we see what the question looks like or what ends up happening in practice. So we're going to have to wait almost and look at it in an as-applied basis. But the most important thing that we can do, I think, is not a legal challenge. It's to build sensitivity in communities, to educate people about what the census is, what it's used for, and to develop, in Alabama, I think you and I have discussed, I think we ought to arm a generation of college kids with iPads and send them out into communities that may not otherwise have access to the census to make sure that they're counted, because something we know about this census is it's underfunded. It does not have the staff that previous censuses have had. They have not done the testing to validate their collection methods. So previously, you know, people taking the census would knock on your door, virtual or otherwise, repeatedly to get your information.
Yes.
That won't happen this time. We're going to have to have an aggressive effort to ensure people get counted and aren't afraid to get counted.
You mentioned the impact of the census on voting. Talk a little bit about it, if you would, kind of the Justice Department's position on voting issues now versus the time that you were there.
Right. So voting is, I think, one of the most disappointing aspects of this Justice Department's policy. The Texas litigation is a great example. There is good evidence that has been developed in that case that Texas engaged in intentional discrimination against voters of color, tried to suppress their votes.
In their ID law.
And the ID law that's currently under challenged. DOJ challenged that law. DOJ took that position until shortly after Senator Sessions became the Attorney General, at which point DOJ went 180 degrees and no longer supports the rights of suppressed voters in Texas and has in fact fallen by the wayside. So that's a discouraging trend, and one wonders what the opportunity cost is. In Texas, a case that was really on a trajectory to succeed and may still succeed, DOJ backed off on support. There have been no new cases, so there are no new developments. For instance, in Alabama, we have a case where the Department of Justice had filed a statement of interest in a voting ID Act case.
Yes.
Statement of interest says, we're not in the case yet, but we're interested, we're watching. And it was filed on legal grounds.
Important legal standards involved, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and that case has just been dismissed by a district judge on summary judgment, which is short of trial. So there'll be an appeal. That case may come back, it may not. But it won't come back with the Justice Department's help, at least not during this administration.
Yeah, and it sends a message about, I think, to the country about the value that the Justice Department places on fair voting procedures. And you know, to me, it's quite a shame because of the reasons that you talk about. It's just so much of the heart of our democracy, and in a state like Alabama, kind of given our history. It just seems so essential that the Justice Department be heavily involved.
You know, as a U.S. attorney doing voting rights work in Alabama, where there's just, you know, a fundamental demographic split, a lot more people are Republicans than Democrats.
Yes.
So if you're doing voting rights work, you know you're making it possible for a lot of Republicans to vote. And we never did the work for political reasons. We did it because voting is such a fundamental right, and everyone who's a citizen who's entitled to vote should be able to exercise that right. It doesn't matter what your political party or your views are. My job, I thought, was to make it easier for people to vote. So, for instance, we did work on behalf of Americans with disabilities, many of whom could not enter their polling places for physical reasons. And I'm sure more of them voted Republican than Democrat, and that's absolutely fine.
Sure. You know, I want to get to a really tough question in a second. But first, maybe talk about the change in the protections afforded to the LGBT community that's going on now.
Yeah.
I think it's particularly disturbing to so many people here at the center.
I think it's a really discouraging development in this administration. We had made a lot of progress. I know when I talk to people in the LGBTQ community, there's an undercurrent really of fear, which you just didn't sense at all a year and a half ago. So Masterpiece Cake, this Supreme Court case that's just been decided, signals just a major sea change. In Masterpiece Cake, the government acceded to the position that you could, based on your religious beliefs, make a decision that you wouldn't serve gay people, that you wouldn't bake a cake for a gay couple. You had a creative right not to use your talents on their behalf. Runs contrary to decades of American jurisprudence that says if you're Ollie's Barbecue, a well-known restaurant in Birmingham, you must serve black customers.
Even if you say it's against your religion because of the Bible, yes. And the argument was made there.
And we don't let people... you know, you're entitled to your own religious beliefs and to your practice, but where that stops is you can't deprive other people of their rights. So, just on so many fronts, we've made losses. We've really rolled back rights guaranteed to LGBTQ people, where, you know, we had in the Obama administration the first out gay U.S. attorney, followed by a number of others. That really signals to people in the community that they're valued, that their rights are going to be protected.
Yes.
In Birmingham, one of the most encouraging pieces of work we were involved in was some work where the police interacted with the transgender community. They hadn't really had the right language to interact with each other, didn't understand each other, and they did this really fabulous DOJ-sponsored piece of work where over the course of a year they engaged, came to understand each other, and the police took a much more
And you were heavily
stepped up.
involved in the department's efforts relating to trying to improve community and policing relationships.
Right.
What's happened in that work since the change of administrations?
You know, I think that it's going forward, but it's going forward in many cases without DOJ's explicit involvement. Fortunately, there's bipartisan consensus surrounding criminal justice reform and police reform. Only place that I know of where the Kochs invite the ACLU to come to their conferences,
Yeah.
right? And so because of that, there's a lot of private sector work. DOJ's participation was vibrant. It involved funding projects like the National Initiative, the project in Birmingham, but also that leadership moment where the Department of Justice sends out, for instance, a Dear Colleague letter that asks states and localities to reconsider the use of fees and fines in criminal justice. That bully pulpit that the Justice Department possesses has been lost.
You know, we've been putting kind of a little hurting on Senator Sessions and Mr. Trump. You were a U.S. attorney or an assistant U.S. attorney during the second Bush administration.
I was hired by a Republican U.S. attorney in 1991, in fact.
And little did they know where you would end up. Is it different under Trump than it was under Bush?
You know, it's hard for me to assess because I'm not there. But this is the one thing that I know, and this may be anathema to you, but the career employees at the Justice Department, these criminal lawyers and civil lawyers and appellate lawyers who stay there no matter what the leadership of the administration looks like, these are the people who form the backbone of the Justice Department and of its law enforcement agencies like the FBI, and I think that they're committed to doing the right thing, and what they do is they pull the department towards that center path, respecting the rule of law, making decisions based on the law and the evidence and not on external factors, no matter who's in charge.
What do you think an organization like the Southern Poverty Law Center ought to be doing differently during this period of time?
You know, something that I think is important is for us to avoid the political fray, to avoid this divisiveness. And I worry so much about this idea of fake news and people not knowing who to trust.
Yes.
I think we have to have centers of gravity, people who are objective and realistic. And like you say, you know, we've done a little bit of criticism of the Justice Department. I think it's also important to talk about things that are done well, which is why I talk about the good career men and women and what they do. And there have been some policies that are great. In Birmingham, DOJ is sponsoring some crime prevention work. It's absolutely fantastic. So I think we have to, you know, have balance, be objective, talk about what's working, talk about what's not working, but make it clear that our commitment is to the civil rights values without which none of us really want to move forward in this country. I don't want my kids to grow up in a 1950s Jim Crow environment or in a 2020 Jim Crow environment.
Yes. All right. This is a question that I know is in a lot of people's minds, and really, you are the only person who I know who knows the answer to it.
Is this the hard question?
Yeah, well, I think it's a hard question.
You'd be like my husband and say, what's for dinner tonight,
Not
right?
quite that, no. I was going to ask you, what's going to happen in the Mueller investigation?
Oh, my. So I don't have a crystal ball.
Wait, bring the crystal ball over. Where is it?
But I will say this. Mueller has brought on board some of the best people in Justice Department, people who have really remarkable reputations and years of experience to back it up. And this criticism that we're hearing of Bob Mueller and the FBI is bunk. This is an effort at distraction by people who have something to hide. You know, I don't know if Mueller is going to indict the president, indict people around him, or make a decision at the end of the day that there is no crime that he has sufficient evidence to indict. But whatever decision he reaches, I trust that it'll be the right one. That's who he is. That's who the people on his team are. We may not like his decisions, but they will be the right ones, and he will make them on the basis of the facts and the law and nothing else.
And we can't ask for anything more.
I think that that's what we want. You know, the last thing that I want is a political witch hunt. What I want is someone who's going to do what good prosecutors always do, indict a crime if it should be indicted, but not pursue someone if it shouldn't be indicted.
Yeah, yeah. Before I let you leave, I wanted to read one thing, and this is from the former Attorney General Loretta Lynch about Joyce when Joyce announced that she was leaving and retiring. Since the first year of the Obama administration, U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance has served the people of the Northern District of Alabama and all of the American people with compassion and integrity. During her tenure, she oversaw the development of a comprehensive initiative to tackle opioid and heroin addiction. She helped lead in an ongoing investigation into abuse of Alabama prisons. She fought corruption and brought actions to protect the rights of immigrants. And she has been a valuable partner in the department's effort to improve relationships between police officers and the people they serve. In these and in so many other ways, Joyce has been a dedicated servant of the law and a tireless champion of justice. Joyce, on behalf of everyone at the Southern Poverty Law Center, we appreciate your being here. We admire your commitment to justice, and we wish you well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank all of you for being here. We will have this archived shortly and encourage you to share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you again for coming.